Chapter 17. Lost in Wyoming. North Koreans who flee to the south, an estimated 30,000 since the end of the Korean War, have mostly used the more porous border between the North and China. Foster Klug, apnews.com, 7/19/23. Following White Paw turned out to be something of an endeavor. The animal would walk for a while, stop at a point, stare far in the distance, and carefully sniff the air. Then he would resume his path. The direction Rohan was headed before led to the diagonal corner of the sparkling city, facing it head-on. The cat's path led to the far left corner. From a distance, further down the globe Rohan had traveled, he saw far edges of the structure. Now its front took up too much horizon. Those edges faded into the twilight, and their illumination shrouded their distant boundaries. The twilight of the world came from the structure of the expanding New Jerusalem. Every step brought greater brightness, but the light didn't yet blind the eye. As with the air, the glow itself was invigorating. It gave one energy. Durai was transfixed by its brilliance, and they discussed what it was as the cat plodded along. "It's impossibly huge," Durai observed. "Yes, I can't. It feels like the moon come to Earth and made a cube. But instead of craters, I see design. I see patterns. The kara." "It expands too," said Rohan. "How do you mean?" "I mean, beyond getting ever larger as I approach, the colors change, and the patterns change, and are expanding outward. At first I thought it was simply that I drew closer and closer, steadily perceiving more detail. But as I have fixed my eyes upon it, I have seen it compound in glory." "Is this world, is it the 1,000-year reign spoken of in the last verses?" Rohan shook his head. "No, for then, that vast thing we see there, it would be set above the millennial kingdom, descending slow like a clock ticking down to new reality. We are where it is before that time." Durai plodded along as the path went into a flat meadow swirled with flora, waving under a gentle breeze that gave the vista a sort of texture perfectly satiating the mind. The cat stopped to groom himself, then continued strutting forward, now turning left, now turning right, always on a thin little path that kept winding away, but always disappeared out of sight. Rohan asked, "What have the most extended children of the first family done in your land, that the men are fashioned to be identical human tools of war?" Durai looked at the purple sky and exhaled, thinking for a little while before he responded. When he looked forward again, he said, "War led to regime change, and the bad people won. They started out Marxist. Then the foreign Marxists imploded because they were built on sand to begin with. So the Democratic People's Republic of Korea followed, and famine took over. Before, the government wielded total control. But there was civilization. When the hunger came, the state contracted to a pure cult of personality, propped up by a military. I was born after the famine, before the current dear leader took over, but not enough to remember. They tell me it's as bad now as it was then, ever since 2020. Yoon-hee," he looked at the ground, then looked up. "Yoon-hee was the granddaughter of a defector. Under the new law, she was banished. She couldn't bear it and sought escape. She was shot attempting to cross into China. I know the man who shot her. They gave him a month's paid leave as a reward. Yoon-hee would have been my wife. But the evil of the dynasty and its mindless bureaucracy took her. I have hated the state with every fiber of my being from that time. And I will default to this hate if I don't check myself." but I was forced to check myself. I can do more good where I am than a camp or in the ground. Since then, I have helped the people however I can. In my eyes, if I'm on the border, a defector becomes a deer, or I see a defector going the opposite direction of the deer that I might have just seen patter across the river. You understand? One of them, one deer, as I keep watch, one of them runs to China and drops a book on the shore. Of course, I have to go get it. If someone else sees it, I will be in trouble. So I get the book. I read the book. The book is the Bible. There are bad kings and good kings and slaves and miracles and very long genealogies and many poems that do not rhyme. And it strikes me as a very strange book because what it is saying can't be true, but it's definitely not something you would read for entertainment. And it has disturbing things. So I test it. You tested the timeless one, you mean, Rohan said. Durai caught his eye and smiled. Maybe you have the truth of it, I think. You know what I did? I said, God, if you are like it says in this book, as it says in this book, then you know my mind, and I am here for a reason. If you prove yourself and will show me what I am to do, I will do it. And so you received the demonstration. Not immediately. First, understand I have no family. My parents were sent to a camp on a treason charge related to portraits of the dear leader. I was in school. They let me pack one bag when I come home. Then began my military duty. This made me unstuck. One big thing that keeps us in the terror is our families are killed if we escape or they're otherwise punished. So if we have family, leaving is selfish. We doom them. It's a powerful sort of leverage. If you have no family, the rules change. I could have left, and deep down, I wanted the sign from God to be a way out when I made that prayer. But really, finding a way out, that had nothing to do with the prayer. It was some other mental layer I was putting on. And one day I came to realize as much. I don't know how exactly. It just came over me. So I thought about it after doing my rounds, and I decided on a neutral sign that could indicate to me my prayer was heard. Outside the remote shack where I patrolled, I wanted to see a bird I had never seen before. So I asked God for this. 2 days later, I saw one with a lime green head, and he came with his mate, and they built a nest. And they stayed through the summer, and I saw them every day. When I was off duty, I consulted archives to identify the species and was never able to. They raised 3 little ones, and when the season ended and the little ones could fly, they all left, and it has been 5 years since, and I have never seen their like again. So, now the onus was on you. Durai nodded. I should have immediately made good my promise, but I did not. It took me until, really, the next season when the birds did not return. I couldn't write it off as a local species I simply hadn't encountered before at that point, you see. So I agreed God is real. And so I did as the apostle said and have sought to ever since. Right after that, right after I came to that decision internally, I was promoted. It was no coincidence, as my new duties gave me greater ability to do great things for those in need and around my home. They made me infiltrate the Church of God after I had already come to God, and I fed them such good expired information. They just kept promoting me. Everywhere I go, I excel. And whenever I can, I fail to see things. Or I see things that cause others to miss seeing that which would invite violence. And God smiles on me. But I was beginning to think he smiled too much as I had been drawn so much deeper into the regime. My ability to offset their evil has waned. Now I see. It was all to bring me here. He met Rohan's eye. So you want to know why the men in my land are identical tools of war? We have a Haman, a Saul, a Manasseh, a Pharaoh, a Nero, a Caesar, a power of evil. These are who are in power in our land. Our land is what they tell us our enemies have become. We are the American bastards. They are the true people's free republic. And in our wasteland, one wrong word is that which may cause you to reckon with God for heaven or hell. You certainly had a need to get all of that out, didn't you? Rohan observed. Acknowledged Durai. The cat walked on. Rohan also had opportunities to tell of his home and his youth and his history, and the conversation between the two was surprisingly pleasant, teaching Rohan many things which were vague through the waters, and providing context for certain ancient historical events that had always baffled Durai. Perhaps 2 hours passed in this way. The cat continued sauntering toward the growing mountain of jewels ahead, silhouetted in tiny mountains at its base, slowly taking up the entire horizon, becoming more monstrously gargantuan every moment, revealing the true depth of its majesty and thereby the terrible glory of its designer. Every now and again White Paw would stop and do his staring act, and after a while Rohan realized he was waiting for a snack so he could open a window. He was unsure what to do until at some point the animal decided not to wait for a snack and opened up a portal all on his own. With the speed of a hunter, Rohan grabbed White Paw before he could hop through. On the other end was a dark slate of rock that looked uniform and was marked in perforated lines of yellow. It was sandwiched in grasses that seemed to breathe as they swayed in the wind. Very fast conveyances would blur by sporadically. They were some distance from where the portal opened. Beyond the slate of rock were more swiftly swaying grasses and a few trees. It was a modern road. Rohan said, I was told I would never return to the world I had known. Durai turned from the shimmering rift between realities. Believe me, sir, whatever the world that you knew was, it is not the world that exists. Rohan looked down at the way, that which the cat followed, and which they had so recently resumed. It led right to where White Paw opened the window. Rohan looked around behind the rift and could not see any trail extending ahead. He glanced at Durai, then nodded to the portal. In that place I do not know if we will understand each other. I had to give you the water here. Durai thought a moment. Well, is there a reason that you are unable to bring that horn, that old canteen? Can't you bring it with you? Rohan exhaled dubiously. Then he looked to the massive, glittering jewel of New Jerusalem dominating the horizon, taking up more than half of it already. Before his heart could start the prayer, he felt the truth of what he had to do. He turned and said, We will see. They stepped through. Grass on the other side had a level of greenness, but was brittle and barely compared to the lush flora they left behind. White Paw struggled in Rohan's arm. Rohan let him down, and he dry heaved, but nothing came out, so he lay down and took a nap. There was a soft thumping sound. Durai and Rohan looked behind. The portal was closed. Iri urnium uriru mali yo jonyo ihados who is nunji all about the said Durai. Rohan turned to him and replied, Kya ha ha pane. The truth set in immediately, and they both muttered native expletives. Rohan quickly grabbed for the horn of water, and they both drank. The water was no longer sweet. It was merely wet. Koi Pak! Rohan raised an eyebrow. It was tough to breathe all of a sudden. He was irritated, but not panicking. It had to be the air. He had to fight it. Michin Indian Gadun, replied Durai, and they commenced to expletives and kicking the pale grass again. White Paw opened his green eyes briefly in a squint and almost looked like a smile, then stretched and returned to dreams. Rohan and Durai took in their surroundings. In front of them was a highway. Rohan didn't like how plainly it was built. They were on rolling land. In the distance were mountains. The sky was a gentle blue, and the wind was very noticeable. It kept slapping the grasses in waves you could see. The first time a semi-truck came barreling by, Rohan was transfixed. He'd seen self-propelled carriages and tech from the old world, like the Wind Circle, but nothing to such a scale or apparent cleanliness. The machine appeared recently built. It was a marvel to him, but it was loud and interrupted wind as it grumbled along. Durai grabbed him on the shoulder, speaking rapid-fire Korean in a way Rohan couldn't begin to parse. Every 20th word jogged the memory of the world he had known, but there wasn't anything he could latch onto. He expressed as much to Durai, who was experiencing essentially the same issue. Rohan knelt down and began to pray. This Durai also understood. They spent a quarter of an hour in this way, then sat up, occasionally glancing at one another, mystified at their inability to communicate. The cat stretched himself and repositioned. Deciding what to do was difficult, and communication devolved to grunts and hand signals. They walked around in a near circumference to the cat. Rohan was somewhat perplexed by reflectors on poles every 10th of a mile. He walked up and down the road to either side. After a few moments' similar investigation, Durai sat with the cat. The sun began to set in the west, bouncing from the road as it wound along to their right. Rohan noticed this first, as he had not seen a sunset in years, and so this had a calming effect on him. Then he realized how tired he was. They hadn't come through an hour ago, but a weight came on him. The adrenaline related to the shift of worlds had kept him hyper-alert, as had Durai been quite awake. Like when a driver sees the blue and red cherries of a highway patrolman glittering in his rear-view mirror, even if he's been driving 20 hours, he's suddenly awake. That pulsating clutch of nerve endings at the base of the spine, that heart-pounding energy. It did wash over Durai and Rohan, but it faded. And when it did, neither man was able to resist fatigue, and both fell asleep beside the cat on a littered hillside of brownish-green grass nigh the highway. Neither man realized night had come, and neither man awoke until a lady in a minivan saw them asleep by the side of the road in her headlights. She drove past as they appeared in her periphery, then slammed the brakes. Her name was Madeline, which transliterated actually means high tower. And that really described this woman. She came from a ranching family. She was about 6 feet tall and thick like a draft horse. One would have been forgiven if they made the mistake of considering her a man, as she dressed in a very masculine way. But despite all that, she was all woman in body, heart, and soul, and her attractions were healthy. She was unlikely to find any object of her affection reciprocating any such attraction from her, however, which had in certain ways hardened Madeline, making her slightly uneven mentally, especially in the late 2020s when certain men fashioned themselves women, and women of less than average attractiveness were assumed to be such men. What a disservice such pretenders did to ladies derelict of beauty. Madeline was squarely in that camp. She was all woman, but it wasn't pretty. Even so, her heart was reasonable and couldn't pass by two men just sleeping by the side of the road. They were on a remote hill between Casper and Alcova. There was a whole lot of nothing in the area, no cell service, and the men didn't seem to have a vehicle or anything nearby. Something was amiss. The screeching of tires caused Rohan and Durai to blink awake, standing quickly. Both were disoriented and had no solid way of communicating. White Paw woke with them and stretched, rubbing up against their legs in turn, then sitting, wrapping his fluffy black tail around his checkerboard front feet and indulging in a yawn. Just ahead sat the minivan. It was one of those old makes from the early 90s with a pointed tip like a rocket ship. It was painted a dark green that became black in the night and had headlights rather bright in White Paw's sight. Madeline was parked with her hazards on off the shoulder. Now she rolled down the window, it looking for all the world like a reverse eyelid, slowly coming down to reveal a pupil made of bulldog. She'd been driving east, and so was across from them. Madeline yelled over the windy highway, "Hey! You guys drunk or what?" Rohan looked to Durai, Durai looked to Rohan, then yelled back, "We don't English!" "You some kind of damn illegals?" Madeline returned. Cat!" Durai replied and picked up White Paw from the ground. "Oh, you're dandies," Madeline observed. "Cat!" replied Durai. Rohan looked from the woman with a face like a queen ape to Durai and the cat, then back. He tried hand signs, but was incapable of making himself understood. "Well, I suppose I can give you a ride. Come on, I'm headed to Casper. Y'all get out of the center change store by the interstate. You hear? That's where I'll drop you off. You find the next leg of your hitchhiking there." And Madeline pulled her bulldog frame from the front seat, waddling around to the side and sliding open the middle door of the van, an artificial mouth yawning to be filled. She turned back and pulled open a long coat to expose a pistol in a holster. "Don't y'all try anything, I'll drop you. But I can also drop y'all off." Durai looked at Rohan and gestured. Rohan was skeptical but had no better ideas. At this point, he trusted where God took him via feline. He gingerly retrieved the cat from Durai and went ahead. It was thankfully dark, and the woman didn't see Durai still had an AK-47 with him as they tentatively crossed the road. It had been with him ever since Rohan forced him to drink the sweet water that opened the mind to new languages. Durai held the firearm vertically by the stock under his military jacket, the barrel pushing up his coat slightly near the collar. In this way, he was able to hide it well enough, especially since he got in last, taking the seat directly behind Madeline. As they adjusted themselves, Rohan gave Durai a look, and Durai only smiled. Rohan expected Durai knew something he didn't, but couldn't say as much. Madeline slid the door shut, waddled back to the driver's seat, jumped in, and said, "Buckle up!" then rolled some sort of elastic harness over her ample front. Rohan looked at Durai, who pulled a shoulder strap across and clipped it in. Rohan was in the center, as one of the removable couches of the minivan had been pulled out on some pretext. He couldn't figure out the central seatbelt, so he grabbed the far shoulder strap and pulled it in until it came to its end. He couldn't get it to clip. To fix the issue, he just pulled his hand through the loop and let the buckle rest under his armpit. Pulled his head through the loop and let the buckle rest under his armpit. Durai started to laugh. The cat tried to escape, but Rohan kept him still. Madeline pulled on the road, paying more attention to it than the events in a rearview mirror, which, after the engine turned over, were hard to make out anyway. The interior lights of the minivan's passenger area automatically turned off when the car started. She said, "Nice kitty you got there. Y'all in some sort of festival or something? There a Renaissance fair out at Alcova?" Durai squinted. "We journey." "Ah," said Madeline. "Couple of damn hippies, I take it. I get the big hairy coat, but what's with the Nazi outfit?" She gestured vaguely at Durai in the mirror, who was only visible when his brown hat occasionally bobbed into view. Hot dogs and a barbecue," Durai ventured. Madeline digested this riddle. Rohan was entranced by the appearance of the darkened highway under the minivan's headlights. He almost didn't notice the vehicle's abominable stench. The speed of the van was hypnotizing. He'd gone fast in a wind circle, but not like this. It almost felt as dragon flight owing to the vehicle's closeness to the road. There was a reference point in said road which offered better context to perceive velocity. The perforated yellow line had become a single thread galloping forward, sometimes bracketed with a solid yellow line or a white one. Sometimes the color of the road changed from black to gray. The sound of the tires rolling along it would vary in pitch at such times. These things mystified Rohan, though he had a good idea what was going on. Indeed, the waters included knowledge of automobiles. But to read a scientific white paper with no background on the subject, and even if you understand the words, you don't know what... But go read a scientific white paper with no background on the subject, and even if you understand the words, you don't know what they mean. Concepts and ideas were nebulous things to Rohan. Here he was, finally coming to know their reality. It was waking up a sort of joy in him long forgotten. So it was when Durai said barbecue, Rohan's eyes were in the process of doubling their circumference as he took in the road, and he incidentally said, "Ooh. Hot dogs and, what is it, some kind of costume party you were in? Is it one of them internet gotcha cams? Y'all got me on camera or something? Now she was looking more intently into the rearview mirror. Football, Durai replied. What's the deal with him? He a retard or something? She indicated Rohan. He is our drinker, Durai ventured. I see. You two are a couple of characters, ain't you? Well, you know, though, I know how to party a little. She did something with her eyes that was meant one way and taken another. Durai quickly leaned back into shadows. Whoa! Rohan said. Madeline looked forward and hit the brakes, cussing out a truck which seemed to have suddenly appeared in front of them. Then she accelerated past on the 2-lane highway. It's 70, not 17, Chrome Dome! She exclaimed. Everybody's getting old around here. Nobody's moving in. It's all falling apart. Guess that's what you guys are doing, that's sleeping out by the road, isn't it? Ha ha! Go team! Durai replied. Yep, nodded Madeline. Accordingly, non-sequiturs continued making circuits through the van. White Paw left a number of bloody marks on the legs of Rohan during the trip, but was unable to escape. For Rohan's part, he had long ago learned to compartmentalize pain, so the animal's protestations did nothing to move him. After about 20 minutes, they made the outskirts of Casper, Wyoming, and soon lights like little bits of moon cresting waves stretched into the distance. Rohan had never seen a city of such size before or such brightness in the night. It was what he imagined Gypsy Father must have seen in the city of the Star Tower. In the coming hours, he was about to learn this little tweaking hamlet in the foothills of American Siberia wasn't even the tip of the iceberg when it came to 21st century megacities. At length, Madeline pulled to a red and white gas station that had about 15 oddly shaped carriages of various make and model in the parking lot. 2 or 3 were at the pumps. Inside the store were several uniformed employees who looked about fed up with the twitching, wide-eyed passerby representing more or less permanent fixtures of the store. Across the street was a liquor and tobacco outlet with a drive-through window. All right, kiddies, end of the line, shoo. Durai got the idea first and pushed at Rohan, who turned to the far sliding door and contemplated its mechanism long enough. Madeline waddled around and opened it. There were 2 sliding doors on this carriage. They entered through one and left through the other. Madeline said, There you go, little lady. You need somebody to open the door for you? Rohan stepped out, holding the cat tightly, and bowed low, then stood up straight. You sure got a laid-back kitty there. Madeline scratched his head where he was gripped within Rohan's arms. Oh, said White Paw, squinting in the way of cats. Yeah, well, you take it up with him, said Madeline, and clapped Rohan on the back. Durai got out behind tentatively, hiding the AK-47 under his coat with his left hand and shaking her hand with his right, while smiling big. Durai bowed and said, Basketball roller coaster. Madeline squinted, looking the most like a bulldog she yet had, then blinked, shook her head, and said, Fellas, good luck. She got in the van and drove off. Durai and Rohan followed her taillights as they merged with other traffic, then turned to the Center Change store. It was brightly lit inside, and some very sketchy individuals were breathing fire in the parking lot, bringing incense to their lips, exhaling smoke, then grunting monosyllabic words to one another. Durai knew they smoked. Rohan did not. All of them stared at Rohan and Durai. They can be excused for this. Rohan looked like he walked off the set of a movie about a mountain man, and Durai was like a North Korean dwarf in his shadow, clad in a crisp regime uniform and skinny as a rail. There was a bench beside the gas station on the other side of one occupied by several smokers past the far door. Rohan made his way to the empty bench and sat. A particularly wiry individual with eyes dumb as a skunk skittered over from the side of the building as Rohan shook out his coat. Skunk Eyes looked at Durai as he went to sit beside Rohan, and he said, What kind of chinko shenanigans is this? And he flicked Durai's uniform. Durai knew the Lord, but Durai was a man. He perceived the words of the skunk-eyed fellow were some sort of challenge, and that prickled him. He stood, got nose to nose with the man, and said, No, sir! Skunk Eyes blinked and made a wheezing sound like laughter. You ain't speak no English, do you? Dur-Eyes stared him down. Skunk Eyes continued wheeze laughing. How the hell you get into Wyoming, Chinko? Dur-Eye kept mean mugging Skunk Eyes, then sat beside Rohan, who gripped the cat. That's when Rohan spied the bags of beef jerky through the convenience store's window. They were very much like those Himari had given the cat. Dozens of bags like that. He stood quickly, eyes fixed on the store, and Skunk Eyes flinched right into a wooden strut holding up the overhang of the gas station, bonking his head musically and harmonizing with expletives. Dur-Eye sensed Rohan was about to walk into the store, and he was also clever enough to realize neither of them had any money. But without the words to communicate or barter or anything like that, he couldn't really do much except make noise and grab at Rohan's shoulder, neither of which things he was able to do in time. Rohan pushed through the door of the convenience store and made a beeline to the display with beef jerky. He couldn't read English, but he knew what the dried meat looked like. He had White Paw under one arm, and when the cat perceived the direction of things, particularly the appearance of jerky, he began to move a bit, excitedly pushing his paws into Rohan to leap at the jerky and making several meows in protestation. Rohan restrained him. Once he had about 5 bags gripped in a strong, dirty old hand, he turned to the door he came in, only to find it was a one-way entry. There were arrows on the floor pointing customers to enter one way and leave another. They described an arc surrounding the island with store personnel behind cash registers. Rohan followed the arrows around and looked the attendant in the eye. "Will that be all for you today, sir?" Rohan saw the cashier had his hand around a little crook-shaped device with a flat red face that blinked. He assumed it was a weapon. Rohan carefully stuffed the beef jerky in his massive bearskin coat, gripping the cat and the snacks in his left arm. Then he reached his right hand out slowly until, with suddenness of a snake, he grasped the arm with the scanner, causing the teenager to squeak and drop it. Rohan gripped his thin wrist and looked him in the eye, leaning forward. "Hey, buddy, what are we doing here?" said another cashier, standing to the side. With a slight move, Rohan pushed back on the arm of the teenager. He didn't intend to throw the kid into the other employee, but his strength was great. Quite the commotion developed as he turned to leave. The man standing in line behind said, "What's the idea here?" He had decorated boots and a wide hat. He was about 2 inches shorter than Rohan. Rohan turned to the discomfited employees, one of whom had some sort of flimsy implement with a string on it against his head and was chattering into it. He said the only thing he could remember from Dur-Eye communicating with the woman. "Go team!" And he walked out of the store. The man in the wide hat apparently remembered he was capable of testicular fortitude and followed after, producing a handgun and barking, "Hey! You don't just walk in and steal like it's L.A. or something, you bum!" Suddenly there was Dur-Eye holding an AK-47 and looking like a crazy North Korean. The man in the cowboy hat put his hands up, the gun hanging from his trigger guard by a finger. "I guess I don't see your side. I didn't understand your perspective," he said. "Here, I'm sorry. Check out this watch. See? Gold. Pure gold. Real. I don't even want it. Makes me look like I want to be seen, you know? Have it. A gift." The man removed a watch and slid it over to them. Rohan bent low and picked it up, then locked eyes with the man in the wide hat, pulled out a bag of beef jerky, and tossed it to him, nodding in a way that confirmed an equitable exchange, as in the old days. Dur-Eye locked eyes with Rohan, gestured, and the two ran off into the night with the cat, the gold watch, and the beef jerky. The man in the cowboy hat said, "Casper has the weirdest tweakers." Cops wouldn't show up for another hour, but the beef jerky Rolex heist would be the hot news in the morning paper's crime section. Meanwhile, Dur-Eye was enchanted. He had never been great at English, but he was sure this was the land of American bastards, and it was beautiful. The van of Madeline was a marvel to him, though he hadn't known what he was seeing at first. The gas station itself was revolutionary. These people were the worst of the worst for this country, and they were so much more healthy than his compatriots back home. The lights were so bright, and though the city had a bit of a rundown appearance by American standards, it was comparable to Pyongyang in other respects. Certainly it didn't have the urbanization of that great city, but then Durai considered American bastards might not have to crush themselves into government urban centers. He had many wrong ideas, and some right ones. They made their way down alleys and through different hidden sidewalks until they found a park across from a church that was ornately built. Now Rohan let White Paw down, ripped open a bag of the meat and gave him a little. The cat ate greedily, then flopped down on the grass and purred. Durai gestured and made noises of confusion. Rohan shrugged, eating a little of the jerky himself and realizing that he was not only hungry, but it was stupidly delicious. He handed a whole bag to Durai, and they contented themselves for the moment. At length the cat got up and sauntered off. They followed him about 2 hours, as before, this time ending up to the south of the town at the foothills of Casper Mountain, where the cat found a trail that eventually went to a waterfall. It was a thin waterfall, and this was obviously some local spot, as the trail was well trod. The cat walked around behind the waterfall and looked at the wet rock. A purple line ripped down it, and an oval grew from that line with a low thump. The cat jumped through, Rohan and Durai following very quickly after, though Rohan did pause a moment to marvel at how slowly the cat seemed to complete its leap, hovering like the air had become loose sand. Again the cat heaved, but didn't bring anything up, then flopped down for a nap. They were on some sort of rounded cliff this time, back in the twilight world, and the breeze blew gently by. Rohan withdrew the water and drank, handing it to Durai, who spoke first. We can't understand each other over there." "Did you see how slowly the cat fell?" Rohan asked. "Yes, there's a time differential. We shouldn't let the cat sleep too long. Time goes by very fast in our world." Rohan looked down, and there was a faint path leading from the cat to within about 6 feet of the curving grassy cliff in the twilight. "The path is there," he muttered. "However fast or slow things are there, I don't care. So long as we have the path, and the path is here." Looking back from the cliff face, Rohan could see a leafy forest stretching around a steep hill which extended high, soon becoming snowy. "It's one of those floating islands," he muttered, now looking over the edge of the cliff. Far below he could see water. Looking ahead, there was the New Jerusalem, closer than he had ever seen it, twice as big on the horizon as it was in their last position, where he had first lost Himari and the golden crystal cube. It was brighter, more breathtaking, and more detailed. From so high in the sky he could see it like never before, and realized some of the light refraction spilling out externally came from interior activity of the behemoth. Now he could see a reciprocal shape from where it made a 90-degree angle. There was a very wide, large, tall intersection, whether it was indented or a consequence of gemmed coloration, he couldn't be sure, yet there it was, a great cross, whose furthest ends couldn't be seen, and Rohan realized it must be on each face of the cube. The middle suggested a bluish color, the horizontal line. The vertical line definitely had a luscious green impression. Looking down, he could perceive the gargantuan thing was on land, while he was still floating over sea, and the land at the edge of that sea was further than his eye could perceive. The scale of the monster made his heart pound. It was becoming a wall from the earth beyond the sky, stealing the whole horizon, and yet an indiscernible distance. Floating islands! Durai looked over the edge of the cliff and felt a tingling, excited sensation in his fingers and toes, slowly backing up and becoming pale. "We are quite high," he observed, "and the air is as it was, but is it thinner? Maybe the air of the real world is disrupting my perception." He wiped his forehead and readjusted his hat. "It's natural to be cautious around heights. You would be in greater danger if you weren't. You know the behavior of cats, Durai?" I've seen them, but they are rare pets where I come from, while wild ones may be a meal." Rohan nodded. "Felines, like dragons, have territories they patrol. Sometimes a single lion may compass an area the size of a small country. He, White Paw, is a small lion, and his territory goes in and out of worlds. It may encompass the world, while still being no longer than that of an average animal in his class, for to him Changing worlds is a matter of opening a window, then being a bit nauseous or tired. What are you implying? Himari has the golden crystal cube. Perhaps if we follow the route of Whitepaw, we will find where she has gone. When I see the cat, I see the way, and I lost it before. This is where I think it goes. I think it may mean we must go in and out for some time, until we make progress. Durai squinted. That's part of what started the trouble in my land. Some relic, stolen by a little Japanese girl, and either a Russian or an American bastard. We don't know, he was a skinny pale one. A manhunt was starting when I left with the others, and they were taken. The desecration of our idols. This is what I spoke of. It's rumored people from Bureau of 13 died. That's why they recruited from the regular rank and file. Those Bureau of 13 guys know things we don't. They knew we were sent on a death mission and wanted to control losses. The relic must be returned to me, not your state, for it has a purpose in the New Jerusalem, and I am its keeper. If Himari yet has it, I must find her. What purpose? I do not know. Let's see if he will reestablish his pattern. And Rohan turned to the cat, removing some jerky to wake him. Whitepaw smelled the jerky and ate it, coming awake, stretching, yawning, and sauntering off, right down the path at the edge of the cliff. Rohan followed, and Durai unconsciously unslung his rifle, holding it with the barrel pointed at the ground. He didn't know what to expect, but Floating Island was not on his bingo card, and he couldn't even imagine what else might develop. The path wound slowly around the edge of the island, and it developed the land was smaller than it first seemed, only a few hundred feet across, just wide enough to seem mysterious until it was rounded. On the other side, the path began to wind into trees until it came to a little valley filled with thousands of fat raspberries, some big as a fist. Whitepaw found a point and stared at it, then turned to Rohan and made a meowing sound. Rohan obliged with some jerky, and they walked through the portal to a very real mountaintop. The cat blinked and made an unhappy sound. The environment was windy and cold. Whitepaw moved fast, plodding along the top of a substantial snowdrift. Rohan had to gasp, and so also did Durai. The cat was a black line across the snow very soon, opening a hole in a rock that was near and jumping through. Rohan would have worried, but the time change meant a second in the strange world was a quarter of an hour or so normally. They made it in time and followed after. When they landed in the other world this time, they were at the lip of a crater, and it surrounded a dead lake, and there was a very big hole in the dead lake right in the center. Across the dead lake trailed a voided riverbed that ended in a small pool of violet. Rohan remembered this was a lake he had seen years ago when the twilight place was even darker, but it had been full then. Soon after, they were through another fissure into another quadrant of the modern world. In this way, they made transit in and out, like a thread and needle piercing fabric, in one side, out the other. Probably 2.5 months passed in the real world before there was a very substantial shift in circumstance. The cat preferred to nap in the real world and would alternate expurgating and napping after a change of worlds. As yet, Rohan hadn't identified what prompted the animal to do one or the other, or even both, as was sometimes the case. Whitepaw frequently brought them to floating islands, or maybe to a hidden waterfall, or a trail along a cliffside, or a wooded valley, both cool and mystical. They went through steamy jungles and plodded along pristine beaches limned in phosphorescent plankton that glowed in the wake of footsteps near the foam. Sometimes Whitepaw would hunt animals in the real world. Rohan would occasionally see something he recognized from his earlier journey, but generally there were many features of the strange world he had never known, and the real world was so changed it was as something alien to him. The fatigue when coming back to that ephemeral time-imprisoned space was almost insurmountable. They would only spend minutes in the Twilight Realm, often days in the other. Eventually, the trail of Whitepaw began to come around again, and the terrain in the real world had an increasingly eastern veneer to it, while the Twilight place began to look as Rohan remembered from before he met Himari. It was at this time when they happened upon a coincidence which, in Rohan's mind, was a divine appointment, involving other denizens of the timeless place. A rip opened in space and time ahead of them, ahead of Whitepaw even. He padded along about 20 paces in advance. The cat stopped. Rohan and Durai caught up. The New Jerusalem, unfinished though it was, glittered profoundly in the background. The rip was directly ahead in the foreground of the impossible cube. Suddenly a kitten came pinwheeling through the air. It was followed by 6 Koreans, 4 North Koreans in full uniform, 2 with assault rifles, 2 bearing some large ungainly weapon, and their prisoners, 2 South Korean troops in Americanized uniforms. These were what their guns were aimed at. The 4 men from the North barked orders at their prisoners and tried not to appear dumbfounded at the world around them. The kitten landed and began to make characteristic heaving motions. The portal behind slammed shut, and there was a deep thrum. Durai looked up and to his right. One of the cylinders was coming fast through the violet sky. "Stop!" he yelled. "They're coming for you!" 2 of the soldiers aimed their rifles at Durai and yelled, "You stop! In the name of the dear leader!" The other 2 turned toward the coming cylinder. They were supporting the large, ungainly weapon one soldier had brought. It apparently took several men to operate. Their South Korean prisoners huddled down with hands over their heads, and the kitten ran off to hide. One of the soldiers was dispatched to get the cat, but by then the cylinder was there. It turned on its indigo beams, and all 4 of the North Koreans quickly began to rise, but not before the 2 holding the ungainly weapon got a shot off. A concussive, hissing, crackling round exploded into the cylinder and punched through its front. There was an immediate explosion, and the nose of the cylinder became a ball of flame, arresting its forward motion and causing the vessel to tumble end over end, vaulting over them all and soon crashing into ground with a deafening boom, sending a shockwave that bowled over Rohan and Durai. The 4 from the north lifted by the indigo beam fell, and the 2 in Americanized uniforms took to fighting. It was a brawl, and Durai couldn't line up a shot, so he threw down the rifle and ran to help. Before he could do much, another of the cylinders showed up, and this one was successful in sucking up the North Koreans, leaving only the 2 who were their prisoners. The ungainly anti-aircraft weapon, whatever it was, also lay on the grass. "Brothers!" Durai yelled. The 2 South Koreans turned around and aimed the guns their captors had dropped. "Where did you come from, commie?" "Pyongyang, months ago. But I'm not. Ignore the uniform. Look at him." Durai indicated Rohan. The South Koreans squinted. "We don't know him. Why haven't they come to get you?" He nodded in the direction of the departed cylinder. "Why haven't they come to get you?" Durai shot back, nodding to the smoldering cylinder up the hill. "There is God," replied one of the South Koreans. Durai felt his tension ease. "We believe the same." Now the South Koreans relaxed. One said, "I'm Kyun. This is Jin." Kyun was slightly shorter than Jin, but both were in excellent shape and clean-shaven. Jin had a scar over one eyebrow. Scratching it, he said, "We should check for survivors over there." He nodded to the cylinder. Rohan walked forward. "How did you come to be here?" "I am Rohan Hanuman." The South Koreans, in Americanized camouflage, looked at the hand, then at him, then at Durai. "What did he say?" "You must drink the water to know. Hold on," he said, and Rohan handed over the canteen. They all drank, then exchanged pleasantries with Rohan, who restated his question. "How did you come to be here, and in this circumstance?" Kyun said, "We were getting a family to Seoul on the border, and the Pinko army here were waiting for us. The family didn't need help. They were bait. We got caught. They stole the cat, and now, you see. Speaking of, Jin, find Sophie." He turned back to Durai. "Sophie's the cat. She'll be mad now, meaning we're going to lose a year before she calms down. Outside Sophie, we're sunk. We don't have a spare like usual. Blasted commies!" "Good thing we do," Durai noted, indicating White Paw, who was in their periphery. "Oh, excellent!" Kyun pumped his fist in the air. "We just lose a couple days for the time differential. I can live with that. Ricky will understand when we check in." Jin found Sophie hidden in tall grasses after a moment. She hissed and spit at him, unused to the rough treatment the North Koreans had rendered. Jin caught her, made calming noises, and pulled a flat square from his back, which he expanded. He fastened a few straps, and it became a cubical enclosure with netting over external openings for air. In went little Sophie, and he put it back on his shoulders. It was a cat pack of military manufacture. Rohan chuckled. I could use one of those, and he looked to White Paw. There was indeed evidence of a winding way near the animal. The path of the cat now wound up and down a hill toward the rut in the earth dug by the crashed alien cylinder. Rohan sighed, but supposed this meant they must follow. He nodded to the cylinder. How did they take it down? Portable railgun, Jin replied. They didn't develop it. Don't know how they got their dirty fingers on it. I've heard rumors of a computer. Quantum Miru, the QAI, Durai offered. Jin's eyebrow jumped up. A quantum computer named Dragon? Stands for Future Remaker. Durai said this in Korean, and it came out as Mireille Remekyo. He continued, the initials are Mium for Mireille and Rior for Remeko. So, Miru, Jin finished. Precisely. And that just happens to coincide with folklore about a demon dragon demigod. That just happens to be the case. Durai shrugged. I just live there. I couldn't tell you any more than the name of it, and that from propaganda. Well, however your boys got this railgun, arms dealers or quantum computers, it's done now. Look at it. They had one chance to hit a target and it's fried. Not much of a railgun. Glad they hit the little green men, I guess. He hefted the heavy railgun, grunting to lift it only a few inches, then dropped it. I suppose they made it count. Durai laughed. We are resourceful in the north. It is admirable in its own way, acknowledged Kuhn. When they got to the cylinder, they found a massive thing the size of a building on its side and oriented internally as though it had been standing vertically. It was limned in emerald colors, strictly emerald. There was nothing purple about it. The cylinder was rounded at the front and constructed in segments, much like a snake or a worm. The railgun punched a hole directly through the middle of the craft, but this had a curious effect. The inside of the cylinder was much like a silo. A staircase wound around a hollow core, and around the stairs were varying rooms. In the center of the cylinder, like the hole of a spindle, was the pilot's couch. It was a square sheet of some sort of non-Newtonian fluid that was above the empty space of the spiral stair, a platform at its top. When they arrived, everything was confusing because it seemed as though the rounded front of the cylinder would have been the top of it, but appeared instead to be its front. It flew horizontally, but its interior was oriented vertically. Outside some sort of gravity inversion technology, this made no sense. A sick ball of green energy was in the center of the square at the top of the stair, and it slowly dripped into the sky until it was gone. In point of fact, the cylinder was dripping green into the sky from every crevice, again as though gravity were somehow inverted. Inside, they found rooms separated by curtains that seemed to be gray flesh. Those rooms contained slabs like hospital beds, but sideways, growing right out of the walls. Some sort of white cheese substance rooted corpses to the tables, very old corpses with varying tubes trailing in and out of them. One creature in gray skin and black eyes crawled sideways from a room that should have been oriented differently. As it came out, there was a palpable sense of fear ahead of it, a sense that was downright paralyzing. Rohan had experienced this before. His saber was out fast, slicing quickly through the decrepit homunculus. It collapsed like a balloon, and green strangeness floated up from it, bleeding through gaps in the hull to the twilight sky. What are they? Asked Durai, pulling himself gingerly over, railing around the sideways stair. Flesh suits for spirits that shouldn't exist and seek disallowed embodiment, Rohan replied. Kuhn and Jin were ahead, checking each room. One of them said, They're absolutely powerless for those with God. and almost insurmountable to those without. Somebody in North Korea knows of them, or those fellows who got the better of us would not have come with a railgun. There were only 2 men alive in the structure, and about half a dozen other dazed creatures that looked alien but disappeared at the slightest resistance. They projected a sort of emotional fear you could chew like ink from a squid. But knowing what it was gave the mind an ability to withstand it. The 2 men they found alive were at the very end of the cylinder, the bottom, as it were, of the fallen skyscraper. A hole had been punched through the bottom/back of the cylinder, and some sort of mechanized infrastructure still dripped and sparked. In front of this was a final level of rooms surrounding the sideways stairs. With shaven heads and pale visages, 2 North Koreans yet survived, but were comatose, breathing raggedly under the organic cheese-like substance rooting them to slabs. Durai, Jin, Kyun, and Rohan all had to help get them safely down. Both men stayed unconscious and represented heavy, awkward packages. White Paw was put in Jin's cat carrier with Sophie to free up hands, and though the cats were not overly fond of one another, they eventually were able to tolerate such unwanted proximity of necessity. White Paw couldn't have known Sophie was something like his great-great-great-great-grandniece, but they were both pitch-black, long-haired felines. Since they did look and smell somewhat similar in their kitty minds, they were able to mutually ignore one another more easily. The unconscious men continued to rasp unconsciously where they were laid on the sideways hull of the inhuman vessel. Durai said, This is Do-yoon and Baek-hyun. All 3 of the other men looked at each other and said, Who? They are the men that came here with me. I saw them taken like the others were into the sky. I never thought I'd see them again. But you prayed for them, Rohan observed. I did, Durai acknowledged, and a look came over him. So you must have thought you would on some level. They're going to need to get to the real world before they wake up and attract more of those things, said Kyun. Agreed, Jin nodded. After a moment's consideration on the best way to go about it, they picked the men back up and made their way out past the sparking machinery of the hole punched by the rail gun. When they were in a meadow again, Jin laid down one of the men on grass, Do-yoon, according to Durai. Baek-hyun, his brown-fatigued fellow, was set beside him. The cats yowled in Jin's backpack, but he paid them no mind as he pulled a map from inside his military fatigues. He looked up toward where they had encountered the cylinder as they were forced into the twilight world, then back at the map. If we head about 100 yards that way, he pointed vaguely toward the crystalline city in the distance, there's one that comes out in Busan. Let me look at the exit point, Hyun said, and pulled another sheet of papers from his own jacket pocket. It'll be risky, he muttered. Looks like it comes out in the middle of a movie theater. I say we risk it. You guys coming? Jin looked to Rohan and Durai. Rohan saw a path no one else could, and it followed where Jin pointed. He nodded. This is where the path leads, he said. I do have one question. Jin looked up. Yes? There is a girl, Himari. She has something that is mine. Yes, we have heard about her. Our boss has awaited her in Yakutsk. Where in Yakutsk? Jin produced the map and pointed to an area that was circled. There! Kyun, let him see the other one so he can gauge it. For one map was of the Twilight world, the other of the real world. Rohan studied them both closely, finally saying, Might I have these? Well, let us get back first, then yes, we can get copies. Rohan smiled. They made a brief hike, carrying the comatose North Korean soldiers in their wet, faded uniforms, and with a few snacks from Rohan, White Paw opened a hole in the world that literally came out of a movie screen. For the right film, it would have been very interesting, but this was a romantic comedy, and the theatergoers thought the portal hopping was some sort of stunt, as the rift opened in the middle of an intimate scene, then closed when a cat barfed in somebody's popcorn. Nobody got to see the salacious moments they spent money for. Angry expletives followed them out the room. Shun and Jin paid the discomfited theatergoers no mind, phones out as they dialed for help, and quickly obtained the location of a near safe house. Durai and Rohan stayed close. Rohan knew he would have no way of communicating here, not unless he remained a long time indeed and learned the language. This thought did set up resonance in his mind for a while, though, and he realized if he really wanted to, he could pull back, forget the strange world and that golden crystal cube, and he could rest. He could explore the treats of this magical future world, learn to drive one of those fast carriages, and whatever else his hand found to do. As the Koreans chattered incomprehensibly around him, Rohan was quite taken with this idea and found, with the general fatigue of a crossing, that it cast him into a certain melancholy. He continued to meditate on these things incidentally as fatigue came, following behind the others as they made their way in a circuitous pattern for security to the safe house. They all were able to rest for a time. Eventually, someone came to pick up Jin and Hyun. They explained about Durai to those who were their supporters, and Durai was enthusiastic to supply any information about the North and associated operations he could. Afterward, this group took the unconscious soldiers in hand, and those persons were taken Rohan knew not where. When he felt somewhat clear-headed again after a good sleep, Rohan found where the maps were kept in the military jackets of Kyun and Jin. They were in the safe house several days by the time he decided this was his course of action. He had asked already in the other world, and he could not make himself easily understood now, nor did he have much interest in doing so. To learn communication here was to invite greater temptation. It was time to go. Rohan retrieved White Paw and realized it would be convenient if he could control the cat a bit better between jumps, then remembered the cat bag Jin had worn. The cat bag was in the room with White Paw and several other felines Rohan had never seen, save little Sophie. There were actually about a dozen bags like that. Rohan put White Paw in the nearest one, donned it as one would a backpack, and like a cat himself, slinked off into the night. Durai would be safe, and had his fellows from the north with him in answer to prayer. God had already helped to save Durai's fellows through Durai's faith. Furthermore, the South Koreans had new information they could use for their noble purpose. So Rohan resumed his journey. He wasn't missed until he had been gone most of the day. Durai was slightly saddened at Rohan's departure, especially as it came without any indication, but remembering their time in and out of countries where neither knew the language, he at least understood that side of it, and he was happy to be among those who knew Korean, and in the South no less. Kyun and Jin reported the incident to Ricky, who was also unfamiliar with Rohan, though he knew of the cube and Himari. The information about Mairu was also news to Ricky. After he properly separated from the Koreans, Rohan followed White Paw down a thin but steep alley until they came to a garden atop a hill overlooking Busan, which was in the last days of summer. White Paw opened a little hole in the ground this time, and when they shifted, they came out inside a cave with a view on the crystal skyline of the future Jerusalem. White Paw yawned, not bringing up his lunch this time, though the portal closed, and after a brief stretch, the cat ran along his strange path to the top of a jagged mound of rock, soon curling up, squinting his eyes, and commencing a purr. It was then Rohan noticed a peculiar smell he hadn't encountered since before he came to the Twilight World and its varying eccentricities. Then he heard a low rumble. Rohan's eyes tracked slowly upward, growing increasingly wide as he began to feel a thrill in the base of his stomach. White Paw had just climbed atop the inert form of an old dragon, so large he seemed to be a hillside. His rumbling could have been quaking of the earth as he hibernated deeply in that cavern of the Twilight Land. Immediately, Rohan felt for the gold watch in his pocket. It was there all right, and he could put it to use with the beast. The thought then came to him, this was precisely what he was meant to do, and the little detour he took armed him with things he would need for the next leg of the journey. A chill danced across his flesh. The ways of the Timeless One were mysterious indeed.